What famous person did horrible things that people largely forgot about? Salvador Dali found a thrill in torturing and killing living things, both animals and humans. He tried to kill his sister and one of his lovers. He tortured and killed animals. George Orwell wrote a scathing condemnation of our willingness to overlook what a horrible sociopath he was just so that he might paint us another pretty picture. A summary. Link the original article. Link. That's so surprising, his art made him seem so stable. Travis Scott essentially leaving his manager for dead in the studio. His loyal ex-manager who suffered from seizures, had one while Travis was with him. Travis abandoned him while it was happening and went home, then texted him firing him a day later saying, "I can't have a manager who's shaking on the ground and shit." The lack of empathy continued with Astro World. Robert H. Richards IV Richards, who's the heir to the DuPont family's estimated $14 billion, was arrested in 2009 for repeatedly sexually assaulting his 3-year-old daughter. The billionaire offered to take a polygraph test to clear his name, but he failed the exam and eventually confessed to the charges. He should have received a sentence of potentially 30 years in prison, but his lawyers were able to change the charge to 4th-degree rape, and he was given 8 years in prison. However, the court believed he wouldn't fare well in prison, so his sentence was suspended and he was freed on probation. 3 years old. For fuck's sake. And no prison sentence because he's a billionaire. Phew, that. He should have rotted and died in prison. Remember, kids. The law only applies. Kids in unison. If you're poor. Curtis Kurt Johnson, the billionaire whose family owned the household products company, S.C. Johnson, was arrested in March 2011 for molestation. Faced with a potential 40-year sentence for repeatedly assaulting his teenage stepdaughter, the businessman, who was worth an estimated $4.20 billion in 2019, only received 3 months in prison and a fine of $6,000. Alongside the short prison term and the fine that hardly made a dent in his fortune, Johnson also didn't have to register as a sex offender. S.C. Johnson, a family company. Edit. Thank you for all the upvotes, awards, and especially gold. Fuck that dude. CeeLo Green. In 2012 he slipped a woman an ecstasy pill without her knowledge and raped her while she was unconscious. She woke up naked in his bed with no memory of what happened. His charges were eventually lowered to a felony of supplying ecstasy. In response to backlash, he tweeted, "People who have really been raped remember. And if someone is passed out, they're not even with you consciously. So with implies consent. Edited because sex with an unconscious person isn't sex, it's rape. Thanks to those of you who pointed out my wording." Soulja Boy beat a pregnant woman into having a miscarriage. Tom Cruise helped the Church of Scientology when they caused the wrongful death of one of their members, Lisa McPherson. Cruise was used to woo politicians in Florida just as the church was being indicted for the abuse committed against Lisa, and later the charges were dropped. Didn't Caitlyn Jenner hit and kill someone with her car? Floyd Mayweather beat the shit out of his former girlfriend, and got away with it because the judge allowed him to train for a fight he was headlining. Chris Brown. How is this guy still getting work and recognition? In this age of cancel culture he is way overdue. John Travolta sexually assaulted several young men, and has seemingly faced no repercussions from this. You'll be receiving calls from the Church of Scientology soon. Jack Nicholson beat a prostitute that he hired to the point of irreversible brain damage. Philip Burke, film industry executive, journalist, and film critic, sexually assaulted Brendan Fraser and his defense was, "It was in jest, not sexual intent," which then he got off for it. Had any of us used that defense we would have been buried under the jail. Not only that, but it derailed Fraser's career. I love him, and his resurgence is so long overdue it's not even funny. The fact that any person thinks it's okay to do that kinda thing is disgusting, and Brendan likely won't ever forget that day. As a teenager, Mark Wahlberg assaulted and blinded an Asian man in what we would now call a hate crime. Plus he starred in The Happening, which I would argue is also a hate crime. Alexander Graham Bell. Yes, the telephone guy, campaigned for and eventually helped to outlaw sign language in both deaf and hearing schools, hoping to integrate schools with both deaf and hearing students. Instead, he ended up depriving deaf students who were not able to hear of language. The last of these laws banning sign in the U.S. was finally repealed in 1979. Canada didn't finish ridding themselves of these laws until 2010. Steven Tyler had a relationship with a 16-year-old girl when he was 25. He convinced the parents to sign over legal guardianship to him so that he could take her on tour with him across state lines without being arrested. He eventually pressured her into aborting his son when she was 17 years old. You can read about it in this article from Rolling Stone. We're going to need a separate sub for all the rockstar groomers and pedos. Jared Leto needs to be exposed. He's a cult leader and a pedo. How is he still working? Remember when a 16-year-old girl overdosed in Don Henley's house? He pled guilty to minor misdemeanor charges and then wrote a song about how mean the media was to him. Because I feel like almost no one does. Ted Kennedy left a young woman to drown in his car. No consequences. This is just one that you can't believe. I always heard about it, and never thought much about it, until one day I read about it in detail. He actually returned to the party, tried to get help, but then, when that failed, jumped into the water, swam back to his hotel room, and went to bed. The worst part about it is that it seems that she was still alive for some time, trapped in an air pocket, and if he had raised the alarm right away, she wouldn't have died. I can't believe that if he hadn't been who he was at the time, there wouldn't have been consequences. Michael Irvin, NFL Hall of Famer, stabbed a teammate in the neck with scissors at a barber shop, because he was senior and wanted his haircut done first. I think it was pretty close to a part of his teammate's neck that would have been a fatal wound. I love the NFL and hadn't heard about it until this past year. He never faced any jail time. Edit. Wow, I'm never early enough to a thread to get a ton of upvotes like this. I'm not sure if this below YT video is where I first heard the story, but I think it may have been, so I've linked it for anybody curious in the story. It's a far more detailed account of the stabbing than I gave. I was just going off the memory of whatever video I watched long ago. Link. At this point, asking which famous person didn't do horrible things is probably a shorter list. Kudos to Weird Al Yankovic for never letting stardom go to his head. Vince Neil only got 30 days and he killed somebody. Paul Walker has entered the chat, so has his significantly younger girlfriend. He was 33 and she was 15 if I recall, feel free to look it up. This is one of many, unfortunately. Jerry Seinfeld dated that 17-yo when he was almost 40-yo and they tried to claim they were introduced recently to their dating but later came out that he knew her since she was 12-yo. So a man over 30-yo meets a 12-yo and a few years later is sleeping with her. Creepy AF, and nobody mentions it whenever he goes on some show to act all high and mighty about his dogshit comedy stylings. He just got a free pass. The 70s and early 80s is full of directors and musicians openly being with straight-up children. The asshole from the Eagles had a child overdose at his home and then claimed the massive stockpile of drugs found were hers. I'm talking enough coke and pills to kill a small nation, and he claimed they were this dead kid's drugs. Just zero shame or remorse shown to this day. She was something like a 15-yo runaway. Her friend lived and was also a teenager at the time. Claims were that they were prostitutes, but I don't think that was ever verified. Too many adult child stories to post here. Awful shit some very famous people just never had repercussions for. Howard Stern totally called out Jerry Seinfeld about his teenage girlfriend back in 1993. Link. They did not speak for years after this, and Jerry was a regular guest on his show at the time. The great Janice Ian sang the song. When Luke Besson was almost 30, he befriended a 12-year-old girl who he later got pregnant when she was 15. Boy George abducted tortured a man in 2007. Now he's a man with convulsion. Edit. Okay, this went a bit nuts. Thanks for the gold. Glad I could make some of you laugh. Cheers. Coco Chanel. Let me guess. Nazis. Ratted her Jewish employees out to the Nazis, then got them back at a reduced rate as slaves from the camps. Everyone forgets Kobe Bryant was arrested for rape and the case eventually dismissed after the accuser refused to testify. He later paid up after a civil suit was filed. Jared Leto. Bro really raped and sexually assaulted underage girls, and so much people act like he's done nothing wrong. Not even any deal or movie drops. He's still consistently hired all around, and it's the dumbest shit in the world. Cheryl Cole beat the living daylights out of a toilet attendant. Ronald Reagan sold weapons to Iranian terrorists and gave the money to bunch of coke dealers in Central America to fight communism. Reagan essentially is the reason crack becomes so popular in the 80s despite being one of the toughest presidents on drugs. Travis Scott and his Astroworld event that killed multiple people while he told everyone to put their middle fingers up to the ambulance that was trying to save the dying people. Steve Sociopath Jobs. He berated his daughter for being born to his mistress, refused to install heating in her bedroom, reiterated she isn't getting a penny of his $400 million fortune, then told her she smelled like a toilet on his deathbed. I hope she's an avid Samsung consumer. Don King stomped an employee to death, after pistol whipping him, over $600 that he claimed the man owed him in the form of a gambling debt. Then, probably with no small amount of lobbying on his part, the Cleveland City Council considered renaming the same street where it happened after him. No, not after the victim, Sam Garrett, but after the man who, again, stomped him to death. Who was convicted, although he unfortunately only served just shy of 4 years in prison. After which, he was and is a free man, while Sam Garrett, obviously, is still deceased. Not quite only in America, but man, there are too many stories like this. And seemingly more with each passing day. It would be nice to have a functioning justice system. Worthless pieces of shit like Don King will eventually go the way of all flesh. Whether they go on to burn in hell for eternity or not, but there should be some accounting in this life, as well. Jeffree Star. People forgot about racism but freaked out and cancelled TikToker Michaela over eyelashes. Jeffree Star called people of color apes, threatened to spray them with battery acid, used the N slur with the hard R, and people forgave him. Not me. Roman Polanski. The guy still gets awards and has to be careful about going because there's still an arrest warrant for him from California. The complaint against him gives graphic details about what he did, don't want to repeat them here. He is revered in many movie circles. AMD, they totally ignore his terrible past. For what it's worth, there's also this list of famous people who came out against Polanski all the way back in 2009. Neil Gaiman, Kevin Smith, Jamie Lee Curtis, Jesse Eisenberg, Woody Harrelson, Wanda Sykes, Michael Cudlitz, Melissa Gilbert, John Legend, Jewel, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Eve Ensler, Jimmy Kimmel, Tom Morello, Jon Stewart, Chris Rock, Lisa Kudrow, John Legend, Salma Hayek, and Howard Stern are among the people who condemned Polanski or refused to support him. Tom Cruise. Scientologist. Apparently once his teenage niece kissed a boy at a party at the family house. He expelled her from the family for 2 years and forced her to live with Scientologist friends of his. She had to write a huge essay for him detailing all she had done to atone for her sins. I watched an ex-Scientology guy talk about it on the YouTubes. Drake brought a girl up from the crowd, kissed her and felt up her boobs, after finding out she was 17. This was while he was at least 23 to 24. Not to mention him giving boy advice to Millie Bobby Brown, Billie Eilish, and a handful of other weird situations. Drake is a creep. Drake, the kinda guy to gulp audibly and tug on his shirt collar when facing charges for underage assault. John Lennon wife batterer and child abuser. Former NHL player Craig McTavish. Killed a woman while driving drunk, went to jail for a year and missed playing for 1 season. Got his name on 4 Stanley Cups afterwards and is currently an assistant coach for the St. Louis Blues. The current premier of Saskatchewan Province in Canada, Scott Moe. Caught drunk driving twice as a young man. Later caused an accident in which someone was killed, but the police could not prove DUI that time. Got a ticket for dangerous driving instead. Edit. One more I almost forgot. Renowned beatnik author William Burroughs killed his common-law wife. Supposedly they were playing a William Tell game only he missed the target. The Marcos family in the Philippines. They're back in power after cleverly gaming the May 2022 presidential elections. They systemically looted the country for 2 decades and initiated a policy of exporting Filipinos to other countries as slaves. The Philippines never recovered. Sean Penn, he tied up Madonna and beat the hell out of her. Caitlyn Jenner killed a woman, and then won Woman of the Year, the same year. Still cracks me up. Orahorn Thifasaden na Ayudhya. In 2010, a 17-year-old girl named Orahorn Thifasaden na Ayudhya was driving one of her father's cars without a proper driver's license. She was texting and driving, and slammed into a passenger van that was carrying 14 people. She killed 9 of the passengers, and seriously injured the rest, causing a massive pile-up on the highway. After the accident, she seemed to be unfazed, and unhurt. She got out of the car, plopped her purse on the ground, and continued texting. Someone took a photo of her in that moment, and once it was passed around in the press, the public was understandably outraged. Her wealthy parents paid for a lawyer, of course, and they somehow brought the sentence of 3 years in jail for driving without a license down to just a few months of community service. Even then, she was so spoiled she often refused to show up to her duties volunteering at a hospital, and complained the entire time. Copied from article about the Peter, Paul and Mary Singer's assault on a 14-year-old girl. Peter Yarrow's 1981 pardon from President Jimmy Carter for taking indecent liberties with a child should have been a much bigger deal, but it was quickly overshadowed by the freeing of the American hostages in Iran just hours later. But now, decades later, a new Washington Post piece revisits the controversial pardon of the folk singer, of Peter, Paul and Mary fame, and reveals that Yarrow may have preyed upon other underage girls. Mother Teresa. Nasty piece of work. She ran a hospice where dying patients were denied painkillers, because suffering is good for the soul. But when she got cancer, she used hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations to her charity to fly first class to a specialist oncology center in California.